Let's get one thing out of the way. I don't think I've ever seen a company make as big of a hardware improvement to their smartphone cameras as Google has just done with this Pixel 6 Pro. They've addressed a lot of their previous phones' weaknesses, whilst at the same time apparently taking their strengths to a whole new level. So, through 12 short categories, we're going to see if it's enough to beat the current joint camera champion, the iPhone 13 Pro. Spoiler alert, there is a major problem here. So let's kick things off with audio. Right now you're listening to the sound quality from the Pixel. Right now you're listening to the sound quality from the iPhone. Pretty comparable, right? Until you get to a louder environment. Pixel now have the option to eliminate it, and it's rather effective. So I'm giving audio to the Pixel. And this phone also wins when it comes to zoom. Like, even though one of the key upgrades for the iPhone 13 Pro was its new 3x optical zoom camera, it doesn't measure up to the Pixel's 4x camera. And it's not just that Google's is more zoomed in, it's also that it's a higher quality and higher resolution camera. And so there's just even more room to zoom in further beyond that 4x number. So, for example, in this scenario here, if we decide that we want to take a closer look at what's happening on this bench, we can zoom in 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, and now 10x, and you'll find that the Pixel's image is pretty presentable even at this magnification. But it's not just zoom distance. Because of this higher quality sensor, when I'm taking zoom photos with the Pixel, the end result also often just looks more cinematic. I'd say the only time when the iPhone will win at zoom shots is when you're specifically taking them in between 3x and 4x magnification, because that'll be just enough zoom for the iPhone zoom lens to activate, and not quite enough for the Pixel's one to activate. Pretty niche scenario though. And I remember at this point in my testing, I was becoming so confident in this Pixel's camera, more so than I think I've ever been for an Android phone at launch, that I thought, let's try it against something that the iPhone is known to excel at. Portrait mode. Interesting results, we'll put it that way. So if you're taking portraits using the normal one-time zoom mode, then both are very good, but also very different. See, in a way, the iPhone plays it safe. It generally goes for softer tones and subtle levels of gradual background blur as objects get further away from the camera. The Pixel just dives in head first. It uses a little bit of digital zoom to get closer. It dials up the contrast, and instead of being gradual with its background blur, its shots look an awful lot like they've just kind of cut the subject out and then slapped a huge amount of uniform blur on everything else around them. And while that sounds like going down the easy route, it might be, to be honest, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're worse in these situations. The benefit of confidence like this is that when things do work out, they can look astonishing. And while I do think that the iPhone is more reliable with human subjects, and that the way it handles blur is technically more correct if you were trying to mimic a higher-end mirrorless camera, things get spicy when you start talking about inanimate objects. That didn't sound right. The Pixel is much better at figuring out objects like hands, watches, bottles, glasses, etc. And while you'll spend so much time on the iPhone faffing around trying to find the right distance for portrait mode to activate on these things, with the Pixel you just tap the subject to lock focus and hit that shutter button. However, there is one thing to bear in mind with this portrait category. If you go right up close to someone's face to take a shot, this is what it will look like. If you step back a little and then use a bit of zoom, it'll look nicer. And basically the further you step back and the more zoom you're able to use, the more flattering a person's face will appear because your lens won't be distorting their features as much. This is why when you go onto portrait mode on this new iPhone, it will straight away switch to its 3x zoom camera by default. But this is one of the downsides of the Pixel because it doesn't let you, instead only allowing you to use digital zoom from its main camera, which you won't want to do because it's going to wreck your quality. It feels like a glaring oversight, especially given how good the Pixel zoom camera is. And without it, when you allow the iPhone to take portraits with its 3x zoom camera, it definitely gains back some points in how it allows for more realistic and flattering proportions. So I'm giving portraits a draw overall. Oh yeah, and thanks to Rhino Shield for sponsoring this video. And speaking of glaring oversights, I'm kind of surprised to see that Google also skipped the macro feature. Pretty much every major flagship phone this year, Samsung, Apple, Oppo, Vivo, when you bring these phones close to an object, they will automatically detect this proximity and switch to their ultra-wide cameras, which have now been given the ability to focus really close. Now, it's not what I'd call a major camera feature, but it's also not a minor feature. And it feels kind of weird that we have all these wacky, crazy niche software modes like Action Pan on this Pixel, but not one of the more standard industry features like the ability to take close-ups. But let's talk about these software features actually, because the Pixel does have quite a lot that are worth a mention. Yes, it misses out on the macro mode that the iPhone has, which also includes macro videos as well as macro photos. And it doesn't have anything close to Apple's cinematic mode, which is not perfect, but good enough to be able to simulate a much higher-end video camera as far as an average consumer is concerned. However, it's got 4 different stabilization modes, Apple has 1. It can take photospheres, think of them like a fully 360-degree snapshot, and a genuinely cool mode to use at a vantage point of some sort. It's got a way more advanced editing suite built in, with features like segmented adjustments to be able to apply settings to individual parts of a photo, as well as face deblurring after you've taken a shot, which is sometimes indistinguishable from Magic. Oh, and speaking of Magic, a tool called Magic Eraser, which can identify photobombers and allow you with one tap to literally delete them from existence. You can pull up normal photos, and even years after they've been shot, convert them to portrait mode. Plus also 2 new features called Action Pan and Long Exposure. They're both made to be used for when you're shooting moving objects, and they're kind of polar opposites of each other. Action Pan tracks the object, thus blurring the background behind them as they move. Long Exposure tracks the background, thus making the foreground, whatever it is that's doing the moving, a blur. These aren't exactly groundbreaking, but it is cool that on the Pixel 6 you can take these without needing to use a tripod. These are both really smart cameras. Both can recognize and copy text from a photo you take. Both can identify faces and all that jazz, but I'll give the software features category slightly to the Google phone, just because of its options. Like here's a photo made using that Magic Eraser tool. It's technically possible to do a similar thing on the iPhone through advanced third-party software, but the Pixel makes it easy and instant. And speaking of magic, if you are enjoying this video, then a sub to the channel would be spellbinding. How do I get back? So, I mentioned that this Pixel has no less than 4 different stabilization modes, but how are they? Well, in its default setting, I've spent hours combing through footage of these two side by side walking, and I would say the Pixel has a tiny bit of jitteriness to it, but for the most part, it's pretty comparable to the iPhone. But this Pixel, it gives me the distinct impression that all of the effort has been concentrated into a few key areas. Because if you try something different, for example, if you switch to the ultra-wide camera, the stabilization kind of sucks. You get weird artifacts every single time you take a step. The Pixel does have a separate mode for heavy movement, but to be honest, that creates so much compression that I can't think of a situation where I'd rather have that than just bouncier video. It's the greater of two evils. And I get the same feeling with this locked stabilization feature. So the idea is that it will digitally zoom into the center of your frame, and then use all that extra information around the center to keep the video still, even if you shake the camera. Like, this is handheld footage. But beyond that very first moment of, oh, that is very stabilized, it also feels like a half-baked idea. Because if anyone was that serious about having perfectly rock-steady footage, then surely they would hate the idea of using 2x digital zoom, which completely crushes the video quality. That said, I do like the 4th stabilization mode, Cinematic Pan, which captures pretty high-quality 4K footage at a high frame rate, which allows it to then slow itself down and add extra image stabilization after you've taken it, till you get an output that looks like this. It's a fun feature, and it works pretty well. So overall, I'd say stabilization between these two phones is about to draw. But okay, time to answer the big questions. Like, how does this new Pixel 6 Pro, the biggest jump in Pixel history, take normal photos? Because for maybe the first time ever, we actually have some powerful hardware here. Like, while the iPhone 13 Pro's main camera is a medium-sized sensor with a 12 megapixel resolution, the Pixel has a relatively large sensor with a 50 megapixel resolution. Well, I am happy to report that for the most part, it uses it extremely well to create, yes, better photos than the iPhone. So, for starters, this phone is a dynamic range king. It doesn't seem to matter how brutal the lighting conditions are, against all odds, it will churn out an evenly exposed image. It'll almost definitely capture more of the bright areas in the sky. Even though the iPhone is pretty good at this, in those fringe scenarios where it falls apart, the Pixel is ready and waiting to pick up the slack. And you remember that face unblur feature I mentioned, right? That can be made to work in the background, such that you can almost ensure faces will be sharp. It seems to rely on good lighting, but as long as you have that, you won't ever get a blurry face again. Plus, of course, bigger sensor means a little bit of extra natural background blur. And the last thing I'll mention is that Google made quite a big deal about real tone on this phone, being able to accurately capture the full range of skin tones, as they should be. And to give them credit, this phone does represent my skin nicely. There's a little bit of warmth to skin tones that I do feel is neglected on the iPhone. So on one hand, props to Google. The fundamentals for photos, they are just really strong here. But using both of these side by side also makes it clear how the iPhone does a lot of the smaller things better. For example, its ultra-wide camera is significantly wider. You know how like the iPhone's ultra-wide is the equivalent of 0.5 times zoom, the Pixel's is only 0.7 times, which, to be honest, I hesitate to call ultra-wide. Secondly, you might be under the impression that because the Pixel has a 50 megapixel resolution versus Apple's 12, that it will absolutely demolish it in detail. But the truth of it is, there is no option at all to actually take full-res 50 megapixel photos, and it's about on par most of the time with detail. It can sometimes lift out information that the iPhone fails to, but equally quite often, you'll just get the impression that Apple knows what it's doing with every single pixel, and that the actual Pixel doesn't. The iPhone is also a little more consistent between its lenses. With the Pixel, you feel a noticeable shift in quality and color reproduction as you bounce back and forth between main and ultra-wide. And it's also more consistent with other devices. If I send one of my Pixel photos to another phone or computer, it feels like there's a significant disconnect between how it'll look. The iPhone has different photographic styles, although minor point because, to be honest, I don't think any of them fundamentally change the style. But what you do really notice is how its user interface is smoother. Most obvious when zooming in and out of things, the Pixel feels unfinished by comparison. And on that note, also not particularly well thought out. When you're using the iPhone camera, it's very clear that it's been designed such that you can do almost everything that you want to with just one thumb, and anything you have to click appears within this small section of your screen where your thumb would naturally rest. not so on the Google phone. There's more reaching involved at the bottom. There's a bunch of menus that sit in the middle of the screen for some reason, and as great as they are, you pretty much can't use these image adjustment sliders without using two hands. Long story short, I prefer the Pixel's photos about 60% of the time if you look at the results in isolation, but you would probably have an easier, more reliable experience taking those photos on the iPhone. What about nighttime though? This is actually the battle that I most wanted to see, because if you watch my comparison between the iPhone and Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra, I came to the conclusion that even with technically inferior hardware, this iPhone's night mode software is so proficient that its photos were reliably better than Samsung's thick boy 108 megapixel camera. Well, my very first impression of the Pixel was not positive. I mean, you pull this phone out in the dark and your entire screen is just covered in graininess. It looks severely unpolished next to the iPhone, and the issue is only exacerbated when you try the weaker ultrawide camera. However, its processing is very strong. Pixel 6 Pro night photos look kind of terrible up until a few seconds after capture where the image processing kicks in, and then they're some of the best you can get. In most cityscapes and outdoor environments, these two phones are neck and neck, supremely detailed given the lack of light, with the main difference being that the iPhone's shots are grungier, grittier, and darker, whereas the Pixels are brighter and smoother. And the reason for that is that this phone spends way longer capturing. For a night mode shot where the iPhone might take 1 to 2 seconds, the Pixel will take about 4, twice as long. And the longer that you capture for, yes, the more light, but also the more likely the image will be soft, because there's going to be more hand movements as you're letting that light in. So, taking night mode shots of people, for example, you're way more likely to get a soft face if you're using a Pixel. Or taking handheld photos of night skies, you're way more likely to get slightly blurred trees underneath with the Pixel. Also, this could be another side effect of longer capture times and leaning more on processing to put the end product together, but the Pixel's colors are quite unpredictable. Sometimes in cityscapes, I'm looking at this like, where do these red and blue hues come from? But then other times I'm in pitch black and it pulls out a color-corrected miracle like this. And if you look carefully, this is a better quality photo than what the iPhone's done. Or for example, this is roughly what a scene looked like to my eyes. And this is what the Pixel managed to pump out. The image is heavily processed, but in this case, I'm not complaining, because that processing has allowed it to achieve an image that I'd be pretty proud of. And it's a similar story with the ultra-wide cameras too. The detail levels are still pretty similar between both phones. Remember, the iPhone is still the wider of the two, but because of how liberally the Pixel handles color, its results swing from holy cow, that's incredible, to holy cow, that's not what the scene looked like. At all. But there is one thing that Google knows how to do well, and that's astrophotography. Even Google's budget phones from previous years could take stellar photos of the night sky, thanks mostly to software. So now equipped with better hardware that's many times more capable, I'm about to blow your mind here, it's better. If you stabilize this Pixel on a tripod and point it up, it will allow you to capture for a long period of time. It will optimize for star coverage, and voila, it wipes the floor with the iPhone's night mode. Technically not an, oh dear, apples to apples comparison, as the iPhone doesn't have an astrophotography mode, but, well, I mean, that's Apple's fault. So overall, I would give night photos to the Pixel. But then we've got video. And you remember how earlier I told you that there was a major problem here? Yeah, well, this is that. Pixel phones have always taken good photos, but video is meant to be one of the key things that Google's finally addressed this time round. They talked a lot about how the custom Google chip inside this phone will allow for real-time HDR+ video capturing. Or in other words, something pretty similar to what the iPhone does, recording multiple layers of footage at the same time and meshing them together for a more refined, balanced result. And I will give it this, the extra pop of color that it has versus the iPhone does add some much-needed character. And I'm also a huge fan of how you can literally just tap on any object and the Pixel will lock focus onto that. There is no phone that does it better. Apart from that though, the Pixel only serves as a reminder of how good the iPhone 13 Pro is for video. Its color science isn't as refined, it's more prone to shifting unexpectedly. I guess this might be the consequence of just having a smaller team developing it. It isn't as reliable when it comes to lifting darker areas. You will sometimes find that you just lose all detail in the shadows, and it's just slightly grainy almost all the time. I'm not saying it's terrible, mind you, but remember, this is the main camera footage. And remember how I said that the ultra-wide camera looked grainy in previews, right? Well, while with photos you can somewhat rescue that, when you're taking video, which the phone can't process nearly as heavily as photos, the output looks way worse than the main camera. There's such a huge gap between these phones in this comparison that they don't feel like they're in the same tier. And this is only exacerbated in low light. It is not good at all. The phone tries to brighten things that don't need brightening, its electronic image stabilization struggles with the lack of light, and there is just far too much noise in the frame. It's really tough to say if this is a lack of team size, the over-focus on photo quality, or just the fact that it's early software. I don't know, but I can only judge what's here in my hands, and what's here in my hands is not pretty. Also, as a spin-off of this, I'd also rate the iPhone's slow motion capabilities higher. Both phones had the option to take footage at a quarter speed, which is what you're seeing now, and I was fully convinced for 5 minutes that the Pixels was out of focus. But no, this is the actual quality of that slow motion. And then if you go to 8 times slowed footage, well, there's an even further hit. The image loses almost all dynamic range and just looks dark. Alright, so just before we bring this whole thing together, what about selfies? Unfortunately, it doesn't look like the Pixel's front camera is particularly good either. And I'm quite surprised, to be honest, because Google released 2 phones this year, the Pixel 6 and the Pixel 6 Pro, and the Pro is meant to have the upgraded front camera. But I mean, look at it. Grainy, as I guess we've come to expect in the previews, but also in most cases, not as detailed. It tries to compensate for this by using lots of sharpening on areas like facial hair, but if you look at my skin or my eyes, it's pretty clear that the level of information is lacking. Both front cameras can go wide, and the Pixel actually very slightly wider, which is a nice feature, but not enough to redeem it. Google did also seem quite proud of how you can now use this ultra-wide mode within apps like Instagram and Snapchat, but even on its wide setting, it doesn't seem any wider than the iPhone normally is. Just grainier. And I guess as you'd expect then, this poor front camera, combined with the phone's already limited proficiency in video, means that selfie video ain't the best. The iPhone's result appears higher definition and less noisy, especially in lower light where the Pixel almost starts to look like it's got a graininess filter on it or something. Okay, so what's the result? I had high expectations coming into this comparison. The Pixel 6 Pro is a huge leap forward in camera hardware. It's the first time the company has gone through this big of a redesign. It's got a custom Google chip. I kind of felt like this was going to be a truly next generation product. And to be honest, in my early testing, it followed through on that. I noticed how photos had this beautiful depth of field, how it was really good at zoom, and all of Google's new cool software features. However, this phone is majorly let down by its seeming lack of real-time processing. Almost everything that goes through Google's post-processing, where you wait a few seconds for it to decide what to do with an image, comes out massively improved. But image previews, and more importantly video, which have to be processed in real time, look comparatively really poor. And it's not just that they're not a leap forward from last gen, they feel out of place on a 2021 flagship phone. It makes the conclusion of this video really easy though. If you almost exclusively take photos, then the Pixel takes amazing photos. It's $100 cheaper than the iPhone, and it's got more options. But if you want an all-rounded camera, where you want it to take good selfie video as much as you want it to take good rear portraits, then there is easily enough of a gap in reliability here to justify spending that extra $100. The iPhone 13 Pro wins this comparison.
Pixel 6 Pro, 3, 2, 1. That probably wasn't a great idea, but the reason I'm confident dropping a not even released phone yet is something called shock spread. It's the material that RhinoShield uses on all cases. And what they're saying is that this one material, combined with the honeycomb lattice on the inside, has all the protection of a dual-layered case without needing 2 layers. It actually means that the minimum safe drop distance using one of these is 11 feet, which, unless you ate a lot of spinach as a child, is more than the height you're going to be dropping it from. And I'm pretty sure this is the reason that they give you a lifetime replacement warranty. But the thing that's important to me is that it's coated in such a way that you can just wipe off stains. Like this was covered in mud because I dropped it on the grass. Not anymore. Oh yeah, and then as well as being able to choose your color and finish and design from an almost limitless amount of collaborations from Pac-Man to PewDiePie, you also have a changeable power button. And if you use the code THEBOSS, you get a 20% discount within the first week of this video going live. To check out my 25-minute video on why I'm worried about humanity's future, that video's there. Or on a different note, the 25 very, very cool inventions, that's over there. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.